On the summer evening of July 28, 1999, the mother of 6-year-old Tiffany Unique, leaving her daughter at Kathleen Grossett-Tate's house, could not imagine that this would be the last time she would see her daughter alive. It was a warm July day, and by the time Tiffany's mother drove up to Kathleen's house, her daughter was cheerful and animated about the upcoming evening at a family friend's house. 6-year-old Tiffany was a joyful and sociable child who enjoyed spending time with Kathleen's son, 12-year-old Lionel. Leaving the girl in their house, Tiffany's mother did not think for a minute about safety. After all, Kathleen was not only her close friend, but also an officer of the Florida Highway Patrol, who also served in the U.S. Army Reserve. A person with such a career and reputation inspired confidence, and her home seemed to be a calm and reliable place. Over the years of their mother's friendship, Tiffany and Kathleen Unique managed to get to know each other well, and therefore, when the opportunity arose to spend this evening together, there were no questions about where to leave the girl. Kathleen readily agreed to look after her, realizing that this was not only a gesture of friendship, but also a way to please her children. Lionel, who was several years older than Tiffany, often stayed with her in the company. They got along, although of course, taking into account the age difference, their interests and activities sometimes differed. Tiffany played with dolls and liked to arrange improvised theatrical skits. Lionel could show interest in more outdoor games. However, despite this, both children knew each other well enough, and such evenings were familiar to them. Apparently, the evening started as usual. The children went to the living room, played and talked. Kathleen, as a mother, had difficulties with Lionel, but this time it seemed to her that he was calm. Lionel was a difficult child, and according to Kathleen herself, often gave her trouble. At the time of the incident, he was 12 years old, and during this time he had already faced a number of difficulties at school. His character and behavior forced teachers and relatives to look for a special approach to him. Teachers at the school often complained about his aggressive behavior, outbursts of anger, problems with discipline and learning difficulties. Because of his temper, he was repeatedly suspended from classes, and cases of theft, lies, and even physical conflicts were discussed in the family. Kathleen, knowing these characteristics of her son, tried to pay more attention to him, realizing that he needed special support and patience. Although, like many working mothers, it was not easy for her to combine career and upbringing, she did not lose hope that she would be able to find an approach to her son. Kathleen felt that Lionel was an extraordinary child. He was smart and, according to the teachers, had a high level of intelligence, but his sharp mind did not always help him adapt among his peers. Lionel, apparently, lacked resilience, communication skills, and patience, which led to his difficult behavior. This created difficulties for him in communicating with other children and caused tension in his relations with teachers. Kathleen, aware of these difficulties, tried to find ways to support, although it was not easy for her. The evening of July 28th looked like an opportunity for her to spend time at home in peace, knowing that the children were busy with their games and safe. Kathleen went about her business while the children played in the living room. She knew that Lionel was capable of getting carried away with the game and being overly active, but she did not attach much importance to this. Although she suspected that he might have some internal problems affecting his behavior, she believed that they could be solved with age. Perhaps it was partly difficult for her to recognize in her own son the disturbing signals that other adults sometimes noticed in him. The evening went on as usual, and apparently, the house was in a normal atmosphere. By about 11 o'clock in the evening, Kathleen decided to check on the children. She went into the living room and, seeing Tiffany's condition, realized that something terrible had happened. She immediately called for emergency help, realizing that the situation was beyond her control and required immediate professional intervention. For Kathleen, it was a shock. She could not understand how her son was involved in what happened. At that moment, she could only wait for the arrival of medics and police, realizing that her family's life would never be the same. When emergency services gathered at Kathleen Grossett-Tate's house on the evening of July 28, 1999, The situation was tense and filled with anxiety. The house that 6-year-old Tiffany Unique entered with the usual childish joy and trust has now become a place where something terrible and incomprehensible happened. Firefighters who arrived first saw Tiffany's motionless body in the living room, a room that, by all indications, should have been a safe play area. The girl was lying among the scattered toys and objects, indicating that this evening began as usual, like many others, when Tiffany stayed with Lionel, Kathleen's 12-year-old son. The room where the girl was found looked like a space typical of a house where children live. Dolls, stuffed animals, and puzzle boxes were neatly stacked in the corner, and art supplies were scattered on the floor. On the other side of the room, there were several brightly colored books on a shelf, including Tiffany's favorite fairy tales. Everything in the room spoke of its carefree atmosphere, a world where children could feel comfortable and calm. However, something went wrong that evening, and now the room filled with children's things has acquired an ominous silence, and the investigators had to find out what happened within its walls. The police immediately began to record the slightest details in order to recreate the picture of the events that took place in the house. Experienced criminologists and officers carefully examined the scene, noticing every detail: the position of toys, books on the shelf, objects around, and even small footprints on the carpet. Officers noticed that a teddy bear stood out among the toys on the floor, which, according to Tiffany's mother, was her favorite toy. The bear cub lay as if it had been dropped, and this immediately attracted the attention of criminologists, who had to find out whether this room was the scene of an unintended child's game that ended in tragedy, or whether something more had happened in it. At the time of the police arrival, Lionel, Kathleen's son, was in the house, and his behavior alerted the staff. The boy was worried. His gaze darted around the room, as if he did not want to look at what had happened, but at the same time could not take his eyes off Tiffany's motionless body. When they tried to talk to him, he replied haltingly, claiming that he and Tiffany were just playing. The officers noted his confusion and difficulty in explaining, and this caused them doubts. Despite his words that nothing bad happened, Lionel could not explain why everything ended so tragically. Lionel's mother, Kathleen, was in a state of deep shock. Her face expressed not only horror at what had happened to Lionel, a complete misunderstanding of what exactly had happened in her house. She tried to tell the police about her son, his difficulties, and the fact that she herself had to deal with problems in his behavior. She recalled that the boy was withdrawn and often got into unpleasant situations at school because of his aggressiveness and inability to control emotions. His impulsive actions, displays of aggression, and outbursts of anger were cause for concern for her, but, according to her, she never thought that it could lead to such an outcome. The officers recorded her testimony, realizing that it was important to understand what could be happening in the house that evening. The police continued to inspect the scene, recording every detail that could help recreate the course of events that evening. The room where Tiffany and Lionel were playing was quite spacious, but experts noticed that the position of some objects, pillows, toys, and small objects on the floor, indicated that something more than just harmless children's play could be happening in the room. Some objects were turned over or lying in unnatural positions, suggesting that there was physical interaction between children in the room. One of the criminologists drew attention to the marks on the carpet and small dents left on the upholstered furniture, which could indicate movements and activity in this part of the room. He noted that such traces are often formed when there is intense movement of objects or actions, especially when it comes to sudden movements or accidental tremors. Based on these data, investigators began to draw up a possible picture of what happened, suggesting that Tiffany and Lionel could actively interact with each other, which could subsequently lead to an accident. The investigators also carefully examined the children themselves, and recorded their condition so that they could later use these observations for examination. Lionel, although he showed no obvious fear or remorse, was in a state of confusion. His difficulty in explaining what happened added to the overall picture of strangeness and made the police doubt his version of events. The officers noticed his fixed gaze and avoidance of eye contact, which could also indicate hidden emotions and an unconscious attempt to escape from the truth. Kathleen, trying to help the investigation, informed the police about all the cases when Lionel demonstrated his complex behavior, which allowed the police to better understand the peculiarities of his character. She said that she sometimes noticed signs of her son's tendency to manipulation and deception, as well as excessive attachment to games related to physical activity and strength. According to her, Lionel might not be able to fully control his actions and sometimes did things that he explained as just a joke or a game. All the facts and details gathered allowed investigators to draw preliminary conclusions that what happened was most likely not a deliberate attack, but also was not a simple accident. Lionel's behavior, his history, and the state of the room suggested that he might have unknowingly exceeded the acceptable limits while playing with Tiffany. These assumptions required a deeper examination to understand exactly what happened in the living room in the last hours of Tiffany's life. Thus, based on the inspection of the scene in the first testimony, investigators began to build versions that were supposed to explain how the game of two children in a safe environment turned into a tragedy that claimed the life of a 6-year-old girl. The evidence gathered by the police and data from the scene helped the investigation focus on 12-year-old Lionel Tate as the main suspect in the incident. Despite his age, Lionel found himself at the center of the investigation. On the evening of July 28th, when the police began their first interrogation of him, they noticed several points that attracted attention and raised doubts. Firstly, his reaction to what happened looked strange. He showed little emotion and showed neither fear nor sadness, which one would expect from a child who witnessed a tragedy. When the officers asked questions about the events of that evening, Lionel answered haltingly, often changing his words, as if he did not know exactly what to say. He first claimed that he was just playing with Tiffany, and then began adding details that did not always add up to a logical picture. For example, he said that they fought in a playful way, and that it was like wrestling, one of his favorite games. Lionel said that he often imitated the movements of professional wrestlers he saw on TV. This confession attracted the attention of investigators and became an important detail in the further investigation. Due to the inconsistency in Lionel's testimony, investigators decided to contact professional psychologists and specialists who would help conduct a conversation with him in order to better understand his motivation and behavior. Psychologists who have worked with children in such cases have noted that Lionel may have had problems understanding the boundaries of what is acceptable in games, especially given his predilection for aggressive plots and fighting. However, they needed more data to figure out if it was really an accident or if there was an unconscious impulse behind it. In addition, given Lionel's past problems with discipline, experts have begun to analyze his behavioral patterns. Lionel could simply not realize the danger of his actions, perceiving the situation as another game. During the interrogation, Lionel said that he often imagined himself as a hero from the TV shows he watched on TV. He imitated these characters, both physically and emotionally, imitating their mannerisms and actions. This feature was important for the investigation, as it suggested that the boy might not fully realize the difference between real life and game situations. In one of his stories, he mentioned that, as always, he tried to show Tiffany the techniques he had seen in wrestling, but he could not explain in any way why this time it led to such tragic consequences. Investigators noted that Lionel did not feel an obvious sense of remorse, which for a 12-year-old child could indicate a lack of emotional maturity and a sense of responsibility. Meanwhile, as part of the investigation, experts also studied the possible influence of the environment and family on Lionel's behavior. His mother, Kathleen, as a highway patrol officer and Army reservist, raised him alone. Her job often required long hours on duty, and Lionel apparently spent a lot of time alone or in companies not always suitable for his age. Kathleen recalled that sometimes, to keep the boy occupied, she let him watch sports shows, including wrestling. In Lionel's eyes, these programs were a vivid and exciting spectacle, which his mother believed would help him relieve stress and give him the opportunity to unwind. However, for a 12-year-old boy unable to recognize the difference between a TV show and reality, these images could have an impact, and investigators began to consider this aspect as part of the case. Experts working with children noted that the tendency to imitate is especially strong in children with insufficient social support and adult supervision. In the context of a single-parent family and the frequent absence of his mother, Lionel may have been looking for a role with which he could associate himself, and found it in TV shows. As a result, Lionel, who was used to seeing actions related to fighting and winning by force on the screen, could consider such scenarios as acceptable and apply them without thinking about the consequences. Thanks to this information, investigators realized that the boy was most likely really imitating wrestlers while playing with Tiffany. Comparing the testimony, they put forward a version that during the game Lionel used force, which turned out to be excessive. This explained the traces found at the scene indicating physical impact, and suggested that it all started as an innocent game, which eventually turned into an uncontrolled action. The version of accidental death due to careless play and Lionel's inability to assess the strength and consequences of his actions became the main assumption for the investigation. Finally convinced that what happened was not a deliberate intention, the investigators prepared a report that explained how a series of impulsive and uncontrollable actions could lead to such a tragic outcome. After completing the initial interrogations and analyzing the collected evidence, the investigation concluded that Lionel Tate's actions most likely caused the death of Tiffany Unique. Although Lionel's official arrest was not required in the usual sense, he was a minor, and his interrogations were conducted in the presence of his mother and psychologists. The police decided to initiate legal proceedings. This decision became difficult and required a careful approach to each stage of the process, given Lionel's age and the need to take into account his mental state. The first step was the appointment of additional psychological and behavioral examinations for Lionel. Investigators turned to specialists in child psychology, who helped determine the level of his emotional maturity and ability to realize the consequences of his actions. Psychologists who worked with the boy noticed that he showed signs of insufficient empathy and isolation. His reaction to what had happened showed that he might not have fully understood the seriousness of what had happened. The experts' conclusion stated that Lionel may have difficulty recognizing boundaries and perceiving other people's feelings, which made his actions towards Tiffany the result not of conscious intention, but of impulsive behavior. For Lionel's mother, Kathleen Grossett-Tate, the decision to bring her son to justice was a heavy blow. She maintained cooperation with the investigation, realizing that everything that happened needed to be thoroughly investigated. Kathleen knew about her son's behavioral problems, but she couldn't imagine that his behavior could lead to a tragedy of this magnitude. She shared the pain of loss with Tiffany's family, realizing that her son may have needed special attention and support. However, when it became clear that the tragedy would not remain without a trial, Kathleen found herself in a difficult situation. She had to accept that her son would be brought to justice, and at the same time not lose hope for his rehabilitation. Meanwhile, the police had prepared all the necessary documents for the start of the trial. One of the main tasks was to understand how to apply the law to a teenager whose act led to the death of another child. The prosecutor's office took up the development of charges that could take into account Lionel's age and the nature of his actions, not classifying him as an adult criminal, but at the same time reflecting the seriousness of what happened. Along with the preparation of the prosecution, Work was also underway to create a comprehensive strategy that includes the protection of the boy. The trial required a cautious approach, as the case raised issues of psychological maturity and Lionel's level of responsibility as a minor. First of all, the investigators and lawyers involved in the process understood that the case would require a special rehabilitation and correction program, since the boy needed not only to answer to the law, but also to receive professional help. Lionel was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and in preparation for the trial, prosecutors and lawyers agreed on the need for a comprehensive assessment of his mental state. It was important to establish whether he understood that his actions could lead to death. The final charge was based on the fact that, although Lionel might not have intended to harm Tiffany, his actions were still too aggressive and unintentional, which turned them into a tragedy. Before the trial began, Lionel was placed in a juvenile detention center where he remained under the supervision of specialists. Psychologists and educators working at the center noted that he showed signs of isolation and was reluctant to make contact. He avoided talking about what had happened, preferring to distract himself on other topics. According to experts, this could also indicate the immaturity characteristic of teenagers experiencing crisis situations. The lack of remorse or guilt alarmed the experts, and this observation became an important part of the preparation for the trial. For Kathleen, the time of preparation for the trial was a period of deep reflection and emotion. She realized that her son might not have been ready for the responsibility that requires a conscious attitude to his own actions. She also began to think about how her lifestyle and the long hours spent on duty could have influenced Lionel's behavior. These thoughts became a heavy burden for her, as Kathleen felt partially guilty for what had happened. She actively sought ways to support her son in his difficult moment, and also tried to find the strength to dialogue with Tiffany's parents to express her condolences to them. The beginning of the trial attracted the attention not only of the local press, but also caused a public outcry at the national level. The case of a teenager whose actions led to the death of another child has sparked debate about how minors should be tried in such cases. Opinions were divided. Some insisted on strict punishment, believing that this would prevent similar incidents in the future, while others believed that Lionel needed support and professional help, rather than prolonged imprisonment. When Lionel was brought into the courtroom, he was accompanied by a lawyer, a psychologist, and police officers. According to the law, the process had to take into account the specifics of the defendant's mental state, and the judge turned to experts to assess how consciously Lionel understood his actions. This issue was fundamentally important for sentencing, since it depended on how the court would consider the degree of responsibility of the teenager. The trial of 12-year-old Lionel Tate began a few months after the completion of the investigation and the preparation of the indictment. An atmosphere of intense attention immediately developed around this case, which caused a public outcry. The case of a teenager accused of the death of 6-year-old Tiffany Unique has called into question the standards of justice and punishment for minors. The court sessions were attended not only by Tiffany's parents, who were experiencing an irreparable loss, but also by public figures, teachers, psychologists, and journalists who closely followed the process. The prosecutor's office presented the case as an unintentional murder caused by careless actions and physical force on the part of Lionel. The prosecutor, in his opening speech, emphasized that although Lionel could not fully realize all the consequences, his actions were clearly excessive and led to a tragic outcome. The prosecutor noted that Lionel had a history of aggressive behavior and difficulties with discipline, which indicated a possible inability to control his actions. According to the prosecution, this raised the question of how much Lionel could be trusted to return to society without undergoing a serious rehabilitation and supervision program. The defense side based its arguments on the emotional and psychological state of the boy. Lionel's lawyer argued that the boy did not realize the consequences of his actions, perceiving what happened as part of the game. According to the defense, his addiction to professional wrestling and imitation of television characters led Lionel to act impulsively, not understanding the seriousness of the situation. The defense provided evidence to the court about Lionel's lack of maturity and his inability to understand the boundaries between the game and reality. The lawyer asked the court not to consider the boy as an adult criminal, but to appoint rehabilitation and psychological assistance for him. A special role in the process was played by the testimony of psychologists invited to assess Lionel's mental state. The specialists who worked with the boy confirmed that he has difficulties recognizing other people's emotions, as well as a problem with understanding the boundaries and norms of social behavior. They noted that Lionel is prone to imitation and is not able to fully separate fictional images from real life. Psychologists concluded that his emotional maturity lagged behind his age, and he acted more on the level of impulses than conscious intention. As a result, experts recommended that the court consider an option in which the basis of punishment for Lionel would not be isolation from society, but a long-term program of social and psychological rehabilitation. One of the most emotional moments of the process was the performance of Tiffany Unique's mother, who expressed her pain and bitterness of loss. She talked about how joyful and inquisitive her daughter was, and how this loss became irreparable for her. Her words made a deep impression on all those present and reminded how difficult this tragedy turned out to be for the family. Tiffany's mother stressed that despite her pain, she hopes that the court will make a fair decision. She did not demand strict punishment for Lionel, realizing his age, but called for justice and protection of other children from similar situations. After several weeks of hearings, the court issued a final decision, which should have taken into account all the data presented and the conclusions of specialists. The judge noted that the Lionel Tate case is an exceptional case that requires a comprehensive approach, since it concerns not only justice, but also issues of psychological development and social rehabilitation. In his opinion, the judge stressed that, despite the severity of the incident, Lionel did not act with the intention of causing harm, but his actions were unjustifiably aggressive. The judge ruled that the boy would be found guilty of manslaughter, but that his punishment should be based on rehabilitation and correction. The verdict of the court called for imprisonment for Lionel, which caused fierce controversy in society and among professionals. At first, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment, but later, the sentence was revised. After appeals and requests from the defense to take into account the boy's age and psychological condition, the court agreed to change the verdict. In the end, Lionel Tate was given a term, which could later be mitigated if the correction and rehabilitation program was followed. This precedent, involving a life sentence for a 12-year-old boy, has sparked heated discussions about how the legal system should approach cases where a minor is accused of a serious crime. Public organizations and psychology experts have held many debates about what punishment is appropriate for children at this age and how to combine justice and humane treatment of minors. The Lionel Tate case has become not only a tragedy for the families of both sides, but also an important precedent for the judicial system. The question of how society should treat minors who have committed serious crimes has been at the center of discussions at the state and national levels. This case has raised important questions about the age at which a child can be held responsible for his actions, as well as the role of family and environment in shaping adolescent behavior. As a result of the Tiffany Unique case, society has once again realized how important it is to consider psychological support and parenting, especially when it comes to children with signs of aggressive behavior and socialization problems. Lionel's case showed that the judicial system needs flexibility in assessing such incidents. Although punishment for serious crimes is necessary to maintain justice and protect society, the attitude towards children and adolescents should take into account their age characteristics, the level of emotional maturity, and the ability to realize the consequences of their actions. This case also highlighted the importance of rehabilitation programs, psychological assistance, and support for families in crisis situations, as timely intervention could have prevented the tragedy. The Lionel Tate case will remain in memory as one of the cases that pushed society and the courts to rethink approaches to juvenile criminal liability. The Tiffany Unique tragedy, which destroyed the lives of two families, was an important lesson that a combination of justice and compassion for children in difficult circumstances can be the key to preventing similar situations in the future.